Welcome everyone, and thanks for coming along on a Friday afternoon to our inaugural lecture in our new series. And I would like to start off and express my thanks to the organisers of this seminar series and welcome you to the new Land and Food seminars. It's not every day that someone is given the opportunity to actually give an inaugural lecture in these sorts of things. So I was very pleased when I was approached whether I would like to give that talk and immediately accepted and pretty much straight away regretted that I did it. Because when I did accept, I thought, oh yeah, I can pull something out of a drawer. And then I realized there was nothing that I really could pull out. So I actually had to go through the effort and create something. I hope that today's talk will have something in it for everybody, because initially I actually wrote it largely for an internal audience, and then I realized that it was publicized much more widely than that. So I broadened it out, but at the same time I didn't want to lose that sort of internal component in it. And I've chosen that topic not because I'm an expert on innovation, nor do I do innovation research. There are, in fact, others within our university who are far more qualified than me. I mean, we have a Center for Innovation Research. So it's not about the research on innovation that I want to talk about. I simply want to talk about the importance of it and what it might mean for a school like ours. I've chosen it because of its relevance to all of the changes that are currently happening within Tasmania, within UTAS, and of course, closest to home, within our own school. And in an attempt to make change more palatable, it's often couched in terms of innovation. It's presented as innovation. And let's face it, who doesn't want to be innovative? But clearly change and innovation are related, but they're not the same. And I will come back to that right at the end of my talk. I really like those images which embody what I just talked about, change versus innovation. I also like the quote, which supposedly is from Socrates, but you always have to be careful when you mine the internet for these sorts of things. But the secret of change is to focus all of our energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. And I think it's an important principle that we might want to keep in mind. I've chosen that topic because I want our School of Land and Food to be an outstanding success. And I'm very ambitious, not necessarily for me personally, but I want to become this school, really the leading school within our respective disciplines. And in our disciplinary domain, that's probably already the case. But I also want us to be leaders in terms of impact and influence within the university, within Tasmania, and internationally. I want our school to develop and grow. But I don't want it to grow in a haphazard sort of way, but in a purposeful, directional way. And for this to occur, we need to find some common ground, and we need to understand each other. And we need to innovate and be innovative at the boundaries. And that's in my title, and again I will come back to this. So before I go any further, I need to say a few words about myself, because it is actually very important that you know who I am. I'm the person who is leading this school. I'm the person who has ambition for this school and for this organization. So there are just 10 facts that might help you to understand where I'm coming from and what my leadership style is. I'm German by birth and Australian by choice. I arrived in Australia in 1986. I grew up on a viticultural research station in southwestern Germany in an environment that's actually remarkably similar to Tasmania. I lived in Queensland from 1989 to 2007, where I had exciting careers as crop physiologist, agricultural modeler, climate scientist, and ultimately as a system scientist. You will never pin me to a discipline. In 2007, I accepted the chair of crop and weed ecology at Wageningen University, the top-ranked university in life sciences. I enjoyed it immensely. I would have liked staying far longer than I actually did. But in 2011, UTAS offered me a substantive professorial position and the chance to lead the Tasmanian Institute of Agricultural Research, as it was known then, and that was a great opportunity to come back home. I value science for its positive impact on our societies, and although I'm highly critical of the ERA, I actually enjoy publishing. Criticizing the ERA is much easier when you have an excellent publication record and you are highly cited. And I must admit that I get a real buzz out of that. I'm a self-confessed change junkie. I get easily bored. The three cornerstones for my leadership style are transparency, equity, and open and direct communication. I abhor backroom politics and game playing, and I strongly believe that a team that has a common vision can achieve anything that they set their mind to. What has all that to do with innovation? A few months ago, I was driving through the Northern Midlands, coming back from Launceston, and was listening to the ABC Radio National. And they were interviewing an author, Thomas Barlow, and he introduced his new book called Between the Eagle and the Dragon. The focus of the interview was on innovation, and I thought to myself, how timely, because I was looking out the window and I saw the physical evidence of the big irrigation rollout that is currently happening in Tasmania. Currently in full swing in several regions. The uptake of this technology, and that's just an example of the size of pipes that we are talking about, will have very profound impact on agriculture and on our rural communities. Anyhow, the speaker, Thomas Barlow, talked about the essential requirements for innovation to take hold. And 3 points from his talk really stuck with me. And essentially what he said was that for innovation to occur, societies and communities must show 3 things: a readiness to be disrupted, a fundamental inquisitiveness, and a degree of cultural aspiration, which I interpreted as the ability to distinguish between valuable traditions and bad habits. This made a lot of sense to me. I could relate to these 3 basic requirements for innovation. And so I wondered, are we really ready for these sorts of innovations, for such disruptions? And how do we know? And what is our role in that process as academics, as a university? And how can we facilitate the innovation process? And then I thought back to my recent experience in Southeast Asia, and particularly a visit to Vietnam, where I went last year in May, I think it was. I'm a member of the Independent Science Panel for CCAFS, which is Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security, a big international funding program as part of the CG system. And last year we had our meeting in Hanoi, and as part of that meeting we went on a fascinating field trip into the mountain foothills, just a few hours outside Hanoi in Phu province. And we drove through endless rice paddies, some of them less than 30 square meters, but all connected, forming a very impressive landscape of rice and water. And each of those tiny patches of rice was uniquely recognizable because of the differences in varieties, in stage of development, in terms of fertilization, different color. And each little piece was owned by a different farmer, managed individually, managed by hand. And then we stopped and we inspected the latest intensification in rice. An area of about 20 hectares, big rice paddy, managed collectively by the 300 owners, mostly women. And we looked at a very healthy, very uniform 20-hectare rice paddock, just like the sort of rice paddocks you would expect in the Riverina. And under the guidance of the local extension service, these 300 farmers now outsource their planting to a local contractor, just as they outsource most of the other activities around crop management. And the result looked quite impressive. And the local agronomist, who was also our translator, he reckoned that we were looking at a rice paddock that would yield about 9 tons per hectare, which is more than twice of the district average. And in the distance, we could see new factory buildings going up. Much of the workforce for those new factories will actually be drawn from the local community. And now that labour was being freed up from the rural systems, in situations where one planter now does what 300 farmers used to do by hand, suddenly there are new opportunities for those people. And the rural community is actually rapidly turning into a suburb. Our local guide referred to the landscape that we were looking at as peri-urban. And I'm not passing any judgment whether that is good or bad. I'm just telling you the story. In the last 10 years, Vietnam has gone from being a net importer of rice to becoming the largest exporter, producing close to 10% or 43 million tons in 2011. Vietnam has also become the largest coffee producer, overtaking Brazil. And although many people are still very poor, there is little of that sort of strident poverty that we know from places, particularly in Africa, for instance. And the feature that really stood out for me were the number of young people, particularly the number of students who are such an integral part of the Hanoi cityscape. Thousands of young people on their little motorbikes, books under their arms, very hungry for knowledge. Vietnam's current population is about 88 million. In 10 years, it will exceed 100 million. If you think we are experiencing change in our society here, visit Vietnam or any other place in Southeast Asia, which is actually right on our doorstep. And at the same time, I came across this map on Twitter. And at the time it was going viral. And it really says in one simple image everything that we are talking about here. It simply says there are more people living inside this circle than outside of it. Now have a look at that circle and have a look where we are. This is actually happening on our doorstep. So I ask you, are we ready for such disruptions? Are we inquisitive enough to explore what our role should be in these developments, right here on our doorsteps? Do we have the cultural aspiration that it takes to be at the forefront of innovations? And what is the role of our organization, of our university in all of this? A few years ago, I found the following definition of innovation on the ARC website. I tried to find it again in preparation for this talk. They're obviously taking it down. I don't care. I still quite like it. And back then, they defined innovation as the process that translates knowledge into economic growth and social well-being, that encompasses a series of scientific, technological, organizational, financial and commercial activities. And these 5 components are all equally important. But we need to be very clear when we talk about innovation, what type of innovation we are talking about. Scientific, technological, organisational, financial, or commercial. Together, those 5 elements form what is known as an innovation system. And here's the World Bank's definition of an innovation system. They are networks of organizations, enterprises, and individuals focused on bringing new products, new processes, new forms of organization into economic use, together with the institutions and the policies that affect their behavior and performance. Using such innovation systems, we can then translate knowledge into economic growth and social well-being. Another jargon for this innovation process is creating social capital. And this social capital forms really the cornerstone for our innovations. But before I come to social capital, I just quickly want to define what an innovation culture is. Because that's really what's at core here for us as university employees. And innovation culture really includes all the actors that are involved in the innovation system. But not only the actors, it also includes all the norms, the values, the ideas, the mindsets that influence us. There's never a guarantee that an innovation culture will actually lead to innovation per se, but it is an absolute prerequisite for innovation to occur. So to recap, for innovation to occur, we need innovation itself, we need innovation systems, and we need an innovation culture. Once all these 3 components are in place and understood, and that communication is very important, that we're talking about the same things, we can start building the social capital. And social capital means many things for many people. It includes the people, the businesses, the communities, and their ability to take the first steps of being able to participate in an innovation process, to have the confidence and the basic knowledge, the understanding and the appreciation of what is needed to be innovative. Without sufficient social capital, all of our best intentions and the bright ideas that we might have will remain without impact. All of our technological knowledge will remain fruitless because people will lack the confidence to be disrupted, to be inquisitive, and to have cultural aspirations. What we're talking about are transformational technologies. And they're difficult because, by definition, they change things fundamentally. One of the transformational technologies that we're talking about in Asia, for instance, is in order to save water, which is increasingly precious, that we can actually move the rice systems from something that looks like this to something that looks much more like this. Visually, probably not quite as appealing. In terms of water use, an enormous difference. Again, I'm not passing a judgment here, what should happen. I'm simply pointing out that it is happening. It's one of those transformational processes where they're actually going the other way. Rather than using irrigation, they're moving more towards the dryland systems. And this is where our institutions have to play a very important role. Because, as I said before, innovation encompasses scientific, technological, financial, commercial, and organizational activities. And that's really what I want to concentrate on. Because generally, we tend to focus much more on the scientific and technological aspects or on the financial and commercial aspects when we talk about innovation. The institutional part, the organizational part, gets often overlooked. But this bit in the middle is really the important part, particularly for us as a university, where increasingly innovation systems come unstuck. This is where we fail to get the real traction. And often the key question is, how can we match the scientific knowledge with the nature of the problem that we need to address? And our science-based organizations are very ill-equipped to answer that question properly. And let me explain what I mean by this concept from Allenby and Sarowitz, which we have used a fair bit. Thanks, Pete. I think I got the slide from you. That deals with those three different levels of technological complexity. So on the y-axis, we have levels of complexity. And on the x-axis, we have cause and effect, the research goal, and decision-making. Traditionally, the science that we do tends to be at level 1, where cause and effect is very clear. Research goals are usually disciplinary-based. A reductionist approach helps us to provide solutions to clearly defined goals. And in terms of decision-making, there is clear control, and we can solve well-defined problems with obvious outcomes. And an example for that is improving water use efficiency on farm through the introduction of high-yielding, more efficient varieties. Pretty straightforward bread and butter stuff that we've done in agriculture for many, many years. Level 2 gets a little bit more complex because cause and effect is not quite as clear anymore. Some of the things are emergent as part of the system. The research goals become much more interdisciplinary. We talk about systems to create options for addressing contended goals. Not everybody is on the same page. And the decision-making has to become increasingly adaptive, and we need to seek consensus on ways to manage reasonably well understood situations. An example for that is optimizing the use of limited water resources across enterprises of a farming operation, for instance. It's a simple, trivial example, but it makes it more tangible. And then we get to level 3 problems. There, cause and effect is not very clear at all. There are unforeseeable shifts which have not very clearly defined boundaries. The research goals are much more about designing government systems that are capable of consensus on ill-defined and highly contended goals. So it's about actually negotiating that space. And the decision-making is about seeking consensus on issues and have robust institutional responses to those issues. An example for that is introducing irrigation on a large scale as a transformational technology that will alter not only farming operations, but the fabric of our rural communities in a region. Too often, unfortunately, we answer level 3 questions with a level 1 response. And that causes problems because then we are mightily surprised when our well thought through answers are rejected, misconstrued, sometimes ridiculed, because we have again combined low value consensus with a very high degree of uncertainty. Which brings me to this slide. When consensus is low and uncertainty is high, we are dealing with the level 3 problem, often also referred to as wicked problems. And science is simply used under those circumstances to justify divergent approaches. And in such cases, more science simply further increases the number of contended options, and it paralyzes the decision-making process. Key examples for that are the climate change debate or the debate about GMOs. Clear examples for such a level confusion. If you look at this table, you see that bottom part in red over here, what happens when we answer level 3 questions with a level 1 response. Science is used to justify divergent approaches. More science leads to increasing number of contended options, paralyzing the decision-making process. I'm not saying that science is not useful, but we have to be very clear about how and when we use science. When we have high value consensus and the uncertainty is low, which is that green box up here, then science can be used to select preferred options. And there is clear agreement about what these options are, why action should be taken, and what the best course of action should be. If the value consensus is low, science can be used to select between well-defined options. And the information may reduce ambiguity about what these options are, but it does not necessarily help to select between them. Somebody still has to make that selection, and that depends on the fundamental values that are behind it. So what is the role of a school within UTAS in this sort of messy, complicated process of contended values and uncertainty? I'm arguing that our current institutional settings are very well geared towards solving the very level 1 problems, but our agricultural sector, as an example, is actually largely based on level 1 science, and the Green Revolution is a clear example of that. The answer to the Green Revolution was level 1 science, and it was a spectacular success in terms of productivity. The problem is we probably exploited it to the extent where we're reaching nearly a plateau. There are some encouraging signs that we might be getting better at addressing level 2 problems, with an increasing recognition of the importance of systems dynamics and how we can incorporate that. But if the goal is really to design governance systems that are capable of facilitating consensus building around ill-defined and highly contended goals, as I outlined earlier, our traditional disciplinary-based approaches are unlikely to be sufficient. And this is where the concept of boundary organizations comes in. And these are organizations that sort of span the space between the things that are normally not well connected: science and society, knowledge and action, fundamental and translational research, policy and commerce, science and art. Boundary organizations cross those boundaries, and they're very disrespectful of silos. They have to be different by design. They're not your typical government organization or university school or CSIRO department. And this finally brings me to our school, the School of Land and Food. And I'm actually very honored to be the leader of such a diverse and highly talented and motivated group of individuals. Our school really has all the hallmarks of a true boundary organization. And it was always my desire to be a part of a boundary organization. The fact that I'm now the leader of one is immensely rewarding. In large part, it's also serendipity, which seems to be one of the defining factors of my career. In the School of Land and Food, we really bring together now the seemingly polarized opposite elements and incompatible systems in a new creative space for change. One of my PhD candidates at ANU refers to that as the synergies of difference, a truly dialectic process that can create new values from vastly divergent agendas. This is not easy, and it doesn't always work, but it is immensely powerful when it does. And there's something that I learned very early on in my career when I started taking on leadership responsibilities. Top-down leadership never works. There is nothing more powerful than a shared vision. Somebody else put that much more succinctly. Vision without action is only talk. Action without vision is merely activity. Vision combined with action will change the world. So creating such a shared vision means an awful lot of hard work, bucket loads of goodwill, creativity, and an optimistic mindset. It also means that we need to have a really good look at ourselves, at our institution, at the environment within which we operate, the way we do business, how we teach, how we do our research. Universities are, above all, complex and heterogeneous social organizations. They must develop methods to identify their own internal strength as well as potential sources for collaboration. They must also strike a balance between the motivation of their employees and the legislative and financial responsibilities that they carry. Universities must strive to communicate effectively, coordinate effectively, and constantly develop and adapt to changes in the environmental conditions that exert such a strong influence on their activities. Universities are also ideal places where the paradigm of open source innovation can actually be implemented and practiced. There's an increasing volume of literature around open source innovation, covering everything from co-creation platforms to crowdsourcing and community-based business models. I don't have time to go into that on a Friday afternoon, so I really just want to pick out one core element of that, and that is partnerships, because partnerships are the cornerstone of any innovation system. And our school, the School of Land and Food, already has a lot of formal and countless informal partnerships in place with other institutions, but also with individuals, and, very importantly, with the public and the private sector. Yet the challenges for boundary organizations within our traditional institutional settings are absolutely huge. In an environment that still favors individual achievements over outcome-oriented teamwork, we constantly have to battle to maintain the organizational support. And this is why it's so important that we are part of the innovation cycle that UTAS is pursuing. A very simplified version of that innovation cycle looks a bit like that, and it's extremely simplified. And I only want to pick out the step 2 in that innovation cycle, which is about defining the optimal university culture. Each university has to decide how their own optimal situation will look like. University must also decide which model they will follow into the future. I just briefly want to show you the 4 scenarios that were identified by the OECD Secretariat as the ones most likely leading to success. Scenario 1, open networking. This is the scenario where higher education institutions are focused or refocused on national and local missions. They are embedded within the local and regional communities, and they are dedicated to addressing local economic community needs in their research and in their teaching. I think I got that out of sync. Hang on, how do I get back in that one? Previous. The open network. The higher education is heavily internationalized, involves intensive networking amongst institutions, scholars, students, and industry. And this model is based on collaboration rather than competition. Then the second one is about serving the local communities, and that is actually something that's been written into our new strategic plan as the 3rd pillar, for those of you who are actually familiar with the university strategic plan. The third model is about new public responsibility, and in that scenario the higher education is primarily publicly funded, as it is at the moment, but there is a greater focus on the use of new public management tools that include market forces and financial incentives. And finally, we have Higher Education Inc. This is higher institutions that compete globally to provide education services and research services on a commercial basis. I think there is no question that scenario 1 and scenario 2 are highly relevant for UTAS. Open networking, I think, is a no-brainer for us, and we are already doing that quite well. Serving the local community, being the only university in the state, I think is our responsibility. But there are also elements of 3 and 4 that clearly put pressure on us at the moment. My main point is we need to think clearly about who we are and what we want to be. Standing still is not an option. Then the innovation cycle will progress whether we participate in it or not. Our only choice is at which level we actually want to be part of that and influence that. The concern that I have for our university is we actually want to do all of these things. The question I have, can we? It's a discussion that we really need to have. In summary, let me come back to my opening statements. Let's not confuse change with innovation. If we are clear about what we want to achieve, and if we manage to find common ground, if we find a shared sense of purpose, a joint vision, then we can actually use change to purposefully create an innovation culture. The emphasis is on purposefully. Often change happens and nobody quite understands why. We have to give it a purpose. I highlighted the 5 categories of innovation, namely the scientific, technological, organizational, financial and commercial aspects, and that it's very important that we actually keep in mind that all 5 need to be addressed for innovation to take hold. And I argued that we need to pay much more attention to that bit in the middle, the organizational component of the innovation process. So what are the key roles that organizations need to play in order to foster that sort of innovation culture? In my opinion, they are the boundary work. This is about creating institutional arrangements that strongly engage science with society and with policy. This requires a very strong outcome-focused orientation that goes beyond counting publications and income from competitive grants. It's about the impact. And impact will become increasingly important in the future. It's about governing the outcomes, empowering outcome-focused institutions through adaptive governance processes that really value the impact and what we can achieve. It's about earning a social license. Social licenses aren't handed out by a department. You actually have to earn them. You have to work very hard for them. Encouraging critical thinking and debates about public good, values, market failure, realizing that science is important, but it's not sufficient. It can't provide you with all of the answers. It's about creating an innovation culture. This always has to be a means towards a larger goal of an organization. It cannot be a goal in itself. Often it requires fundamental change to the organizational culture, including changes to the structure and to the management. And finally, effective decision-making. This means acknowledging that perfect knowledge is unobtainable and it's also unnecessary. Chance, ignorance and indeterminacy cannot be eliminated, but they can be accounted for in a decision-making process. And as human beings, we're actually very well tuned for dealing with that sort of ambiguity. Intuitively, we do it really well. We just come unstuck when we think too hard about it. And partnerships. And I think we need to be very open for partnerships at all levels. Open for discussion.